welcome to Streamable Learning with Victims of Communism. Today's lecture is Communism 101. You'll be hearing from Dr. Elizabeth Spalding, who is the chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the founding director of the Victims of Communism Museum, which is based in Washington, D.C. So if you're ever in D.C., you should come visit us. We're located right near the White House, and we have a great website that will show you all of our exhibits. Well, Dr. Spalding is here to give a lecture, as I said, on Communism 101, the basics of communism, its history, and what students like you should know about it. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Spalding.
Thanks very much, Lily. Much appreciated. So as Lily already started on this, the title conveys that this is an introductory lecture, and we're really trying to figure out here what we need to know about communism, including its ideology, its history, and its ongoing legacy. So first of all, it makes sense to start with comparative terms because they can help us understand something that's new or somewhat unfamiliar. And democracy is probably the term that we're most familiar with. This is the form of government in which the people, the citizens, choose their leaders or representatives. Voting in elections is the mechanism by which citizens choose their representatives. In a liberal or representative democracy, like the United States or Canada, each citizen is encouraged and expected to participate beyond voting. Liberal democracy is based on truths and rights. You may recall that in the Declaration of Independence, we call these self-evident and unalienable rights. And these are things like the consent of the governed, rule of law, self-government, but also our rights of liberty and equality. And in this form of government, power is vested in the people. That's really important to remember as we go through this talk. The representatives chosen by the people then govern according to the law. But those rights are natural to the people. The people do not receive their rights from the government. Rather, our rights, these immutable rights, are secured or guaranteed by the government. So that's democracy. Then let's look at capitalism. This takes place in the free, open marketplace for all sorts of ideas, goods, and services. It is the economic practice that tends to go with democracy. Individuals and companies, rather than the government, own and make goods and services. So think about if you've ever set up a lemonade stand, or if you babysit, or mow lawns, or have some other part-time job. Capitalism is based on private ownership, including your ideas, your property. It's also based on free and fair competition, the free market, and private decisions about investments. And what is capital? Capital itself is wealth, that is money and goods used to make more wealth. And you might ask, to what end? Well, to flourish, prosper, succeed, and do well. That brings us to an opposing kind of term. Remember, we're doing comparison contrast here. That's communism. Communism is based on the abolition, that is, the doing away of private property. Communism is a system of government in which a single party controls the state-owned means of production and then determines the allocation of goods and services among the people. There is no private or personal property, ownership, wealth, or flourishing. All is considered common, but it's not like you're sharing. It's common as in owned by and given out through the state. And in the final stage of the theory of communism, the state is actually supposed to wither away, and the government of persons is to be replaced by what is called the administration of things. Now, this is all theory. In real-world communism, in almost 40 countries since 1917, this withering away has never happened. Instead, under the pretense of a classless egalitarian society, communist regimes are one-party dictatorships that are based on lies, rely on violence and brutality, and repress speech, religion, assembly, and all other rights and freedoms, especially those that you think about when we think about our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. Karl Marx and other communists often interchanged usage of communism and socialism. They also used the terms to distinguish what they called the two phases of progress leading toward full communism. And this has caused confusion about the possible meanings of both terms. So let's look at socialism for a minute. Now, in today's world, so right now, socialism may describe something with a lot of government control, but not full communism. So this type of socialism is a system of political economic organization in which major industries are owned and controlled by the government rather than by individuals and companies. And overall, private property and the distribution of income are subject to government control, which is often called social or public. So sometimes people are talking about socialism that way. Other times people are talking about socialism as a stage of communism that is leading to full communism. And just know that sometimes that can be confusing, and you can always go back to the definitions of terms. Now, of these key terms, democracy is the only one that is based on distinctions going back to the beginning of the discovery of politics. And you may recall from other classes that the discovery of politics goes back to ancient Greece. Notably, Plato examined the rule of the many, few, and one. And then Aristotle elaborated on that and described forms or regimes of government. And regarding democracy specifically, demos means people and krasi means rule or government. Capitalism, which we already talked about, the economic practices that tend to go with democracy, is not actually about rule. It is what we call an ism, right? And in contrast to rule or government, an ism means things like practice or process, doctrine, or state or condition. So unlike democracy, which we already talked about what it means, the rule of the people, socialism is not rule of the social, and communism is not rule of the common. Rather, they are processes, doctrines, or conditions that are all rooted in the extent to which the state, and that can mean the government, some sort of central party, or both, the extent to which the state owns, determines, and actually controls people's lives. And that includes the means of production and the distribution of goods and services. So these isms of communism and socialism are about the extent to which people's lives are controlled and determined. That brings us to talking a little bit about ideology. And from the start, the theory of communism became what we call an ideology. And this goes to the essence of what we call Marxism. So where does Marxism come from? In 1848, German philosophers and friends, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, from left to right on the screen, published what is called the Communist Manifesto. And this publication is arguably the most influential political pamphlet ever written. Marxist communism, or what we call sometimes Marxism, as it posits the historical inevitability of class struggle. So battles between people of different stages, different classes. And in each dialectical stage of that inevitable struggle, the progressive class was supposed to win. And this is progressive or advanced as defined by Marx, not necessarily how you would define it. In the essential defining revolutionary struggle between what were called the workers, that's the proletariat, literally meaning without property, and the capitalists, who are called the bourgeoisie, that's the people that have capital, the working class was supposed to emerge victorious. And eventually, according to Marx, that meant society would be without classes, which is called classless. And remember, all of this, according to Marxism, is supposed to be inevitable. Also, according to Marxism, communists are the purest part of that working class. They are needed to champion the common interests of the entire working class, independent of any nationality. So communism ends up calling for the emancipation, what they are calling the freedom from, the emancipation of all society from what we would term an old social order. So that means for communists, ending exploitation and class struggles requires abolishing the ways that we, for example, in a democracy like America, understand private property, family, God, and country. And it's worth reading here one of the most famous passages of the Communist Manifesto. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. So this talks about using force if necessary, and it will be necessary to move things along, right? That's right there in the Communist Manifesto. And it also points to the fact that Marxism, although often termed an economic theory, is way more than that. Marxism is really a comprehensive, radical ideology of politics, culture, and socioeconomics. Marxism presents a fixed, single, unified worldview that has within it a plan of revolutionary action. And we have to remember that in this approach, Marx always put together, he always joined state and society. So everything was involved. Marx and Engels drew on various German, French, and English and Scottish thinkers. And here, just as an introduction to what you might explore elsewhere, it's important to note that Marx was influenced by a thinker called Hegel, who was influenced by a thinker called Kant before him. But Marx flips Hegel on its head. He rejected what's called Hegelian idealism, and Marx grounded his own approach in the material, in the physical. Everything starts with matter for Marxism, okay? So Marx took what's called the dialectical method, especially its inevitability, and crafted what is called historical materialism. And for Marxism, there is a one-way direction or movement of human history. It takes away choice, essentially, right? It's inevitable. In the years after the Communist Manifesto, Marx shored up his argument for progressive historical inevitability with help from an English naturalist called Darwin. And Marx and Engels together formulated a doctrine of what they called scientific socialism. And this Marxist concept of social evolution is indebted to the Darwinian theory about natural selection. In the end, though, Marxism is neither scientific nor historical, and it also rejects anything transcendent, anything that goes above. So Marx referred to religion as the opium of the people and mandated its abolition because he said it was the illusory happiness of the people. And his ideology, time and again, has either severely repressed or outright abolished religion. Yet, perhaps ironically, communism becomes its own sort of religion. Now, not long after Marx's death in 1883, Vladimir Lenin and other Bolsheviks in Russia embraced Marxism, especially that no-holds-barred pseudo-scientific theory of history. And they focused on seizing political power through an elite group of disciplined professional revolutionaries. And this is the famous vanguard of the working class. So for Lenin, a propertyless and egalitarian society would emerge from what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat that was eliminating private property and heralded full communism. So think about this with Lenin. He takes the radical political, socio-economic, cultural ideology and joins it with an active revolutionary party and puts that at the head of a political movement to unleash communism on the world. Now, this radical ideological party promoted and practiced violence, murder, terror, torture, false imprisonment, and disinformation from the start. In 1917, Lenin seized power in a coup and then consolidated power in a civil war that he launched in Russia. and his regime was responsible for the deaths of millions through execution, torture, imprisonment, forced relocation to and forced labor in the Gulag, which you're seeing a photo of here, and famine. This one's a hard one to watch. The next photo. In less than 7 years, and with help from his Bolshevik comrade in arms, Leon Trotsky, Lenin instituted a military, the Red Army, that joined with the Communist Party and served the state rather than defending the people. And this type of military became a hallmark of every communist state. Lenin also started the Cheka, which is the secret police. And by different names, the dreaded secret police also became a hallmark of communist states everywhere. Now, building on Marxism-Leninism, communist regimes committed horrible violence and terror again and again in dozens of countries around the world. And this number does not include failed attempts. If Lenin and Trotsky had not been stopped in their push after World War I, for example, communism would have spread into Western Europe a full 20 years before World War II. And in the lead up to the Second World War, it would take Joseph Stalin's pact with another tyrant, Adolf Hitler, for the Soviet communists to begin their acquisition of the Baltic states and parts of Eastern and Central Europe. So I think you see here that it's a problematic history. And what I'd like to do now is go to talking about what we can refer to as the tyranny of communism and the struggle against it that we see throughout the history of communism. And here are 10 dates that everyone should know regarding the history of communism. First, 1848, the Communist Manifesto. We've already referred to this. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Manifesto of the Communist Party, putting forth their ideology of communism. And they famously wrote what I also read to you, but also the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. And they stated, the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence, abolition of private property. Next date, 1917, the Russian Revolution. Vladimir Lenin and his fellow Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian provisional government in a coup, violent coup, in November 1917. They could not rule through legitimate means, and to consolidate power, you can show the next slide, and impose the world's first communist state, they launched a lengthy, brutal civil war that ultimately established the one-party communist state of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, that's the USSR. Next date, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The secret protocol of the non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany started World War II when the two despotic countries invaded and divided Poland in September 1939. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were also placed under Soviet control, along with Finland and Eastern Romania. In 1941, Hitler broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invaded the USSR. Although the Soviets and their Western allies eventually won the war, Stalin also did all he could during World War II to shape the post-war map to the communist advantage. Next date, 1946, Stalin's Moscow speech and the Communist Division of Europe. Following World War II, Stalin delivered what's called an election address, but it wasn't really, in February 1946. And he said that the capitalists were at fault for everything and the communists were saving the world. Before and after this speech, Stalin broke his promises to his World War II allies and kept Soviet forces in occupied territories, including most of Eastern and Central Europe, basically all of it, and the Baltic states. And the Soviets forced each occupied nation to establish communist governments under ultimate control from Moscow. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan soon followed in response to Soviet expansion and aggression. Next date, 1949, Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China. Following a destructive multi-staged civil war that saw millions of Chinese perish in pursuit of communism, Mao Zedong gained control in China. The next year, Stalin and he would directly support communist North Korea in its invasion of and war against South Korea. And the People's Republic of China also invaded and seized their peaceful neighbor, Tibet. Next date, 1956, independence movements crushed by the Soviets. The Poznan riots, shown here, were among the serious and, as it turned out, ongoing protests in Poland against the political repression and economic deprivations of the communist regime. They were put down brutally. In Hungary, marches and demonstrations in support of the Poles turned into outright armed battle against the Hungarian People's Republic and Soviet troops and tanks. You can show the next slide. The revolution lasted almost 2 weeks, and more than 2,500 Hungarians were killed in bloody street fighting, and the Hungarian freedom fighter emerged as a global symbol of resistance to communism. Next slide. 1968, the Prague Spring. So there was a reform leader in Czechoslovakia. He was still communist, but he said, let's go ahead and have socialism with a human face and allow some freedoms. The Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, said, And in the largest military operation in Europe since World War II, troops, tanks, and aircraft from the USSR and other Warsaw Pact countries invaded Czechoslovakia and crushed the rebellion. And it led Brezhnev, that Soviet leader, to declare that the Soviets would intervene militarily if any other communist nation ever rejected the party line. Next date, 1975, the killing fields of Cambodia, and the Vietnam War ends, and Helsinki Final Act. So in the same year that Pol Pot, he's on the left there, and his Khmer Rouge, a picture on the right, began its communist genocide that would kill approximately 25% of Cambodia's population in less than 4 years, South Vietnam fell to the communists. That's the next slide. The fight to secure communism in Vietnam after the US withdrawal resulted in 65,000 Vietnamese civilians being killed directly by North Vietnamese forces, and then a series of horrible camps that were set up in which former South Vietnamese citizens were tortured and otherwise deprived and killed. Meanwhile, a small bright spot in 1975 that grew in importance over time was the Helsinki Final Act, next, thank you, between the West and the Soviet bloc, which acknowledged human rights and freedoms, including thought, conscience, and belief. Next date, 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan and the Pope visits Poland. So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to rescue and then control a struggling communist government began a 10-year wartime occupation that likely brought over 1 million civilian deaths. The year 1979 also saw Pope John Paul II's first official visit to his homeland, Poland. He electrified millions of congregants at open-air masses with his clarion call, "Be not afraid." And this is a pope who had long resisted both Nazism and communism in Poland. And the next year, he supported the establishment of Solidarity, the first independent trade movement in a communist country. Next date, the Berlin Wall falls and communism collapses. The Berlin Wall, 96 miles long, cutting off the democratic West from the communist East with large concrete walls, barbed wire fences, and guard towers, was erected by the communists in August 1961. The East German communist leader who had helped to build the barrier decades before, he said at the beginning of 1989 that the Berlin Wall would still exist in 50 and even in 100 years. And he was proved wrong. A wave of pro-freedom independence movements swept the continent of Europe, ultimately leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the end of communism in the Eastern Bloc. And we call this the Year of Miracles, which continued and contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union at Christmas time in 1991. But 1989 also was the year of the Tiananmen Square massacre, in which thousands of Chinese were mowed down in June by People's Liberation Army troops and tanks. So you have to look at both the happiness and the tears of that same year to understand fully what's going on. And this ideology and history of communism, as well as its ongoing legacy, has created many victims at great cost. So briefly, I want to go through the life and death tolls. These show some of the basic statistics about what communist totalitarianism has done in more than by killing, just through deaths. It's killed more than 100 million people since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. This is way more than World War II. This is way, way more than World War I. And it's still more than the deaths in both world wars combined. Now, it may help to break down this death toll in some other ways, to remember that Stalin was much more of a mass murderer than Hitler, and that Mao Zedong outdid Hitler, Stalin, and every other 20th century tyrant combined in terms of numbers. It's at least 50 million under Mao, and it may be as high as 70 million under him. Meanwhile, Pol Pot takes first place for murders as a percentage of population. Remember, approximately 25% died in the killing fields of communist Cambodia out of the entire population of that small country. It must also be stressed that these dictators committed this evil as part of the communist system. And then we also have to remember that these facts are not in the past. Marxism is alive and well. More than 1.5 billion people still live under communist regimes in the People's Republic of China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. And these communist states are antithetical to and repress all human freedom and human flourishing. And these regimes are still also responsible not only for general repression, but also for deaths of people each and every day. And I'd like to leave a few minutes here for questions. So let's turn to that now, and we'll bring Lily back in. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Spalding, for that introduction to Communism 101 and for giving us the basics of this ideology, because it truly does start with the facts and the definitions in order to be rhetorically strong, for students to be rhetorically strong on this issue. So that leads me to the first question we have here. If a classmate were to ask one of our listeners why capitalism is good, what should that student say? How should they respond? Because I think this is a question that a lot of students find themselves asking today, especially with the rise of popularity around communism and socialism online, on social media like TikTok. Well, how should students respond when posed with a question about the benefits of capitalism?
Right, that's an excellent question. I think part of it is by starting with the definition of capitalism and explaining how it's something that goes with, but it's not a replacement for government. And that actually part of what's grown up well between liberal democracy and capitalism is that it's two different things, and you're actually not always combining politics and economics, and that it's good to decentralize, that it's better for individuals, it's better for their families, it's better for their communities, it's better for their countries if things are actually not all put in one bucket, that the state is not in charge of everything. So that's kind of at the general level. And then there's some practical things, again, commit the definition to memory so you're ready for conversations with people. But have examples of how capitalism has worked. You're not saying it's perfect, because nothing in this world is perfect, but that it has been responsible for bringing prosperity and wealth and freedom to try things too, to more people ever in human history than any other economic system. And you think about how before the modern era, when you had things like kings, even if people had something private to themselves, which some did, right? Ultimately, everything was owned by the king, and it was serving that king. In capitalism, unlike any other system ever, and completely opposite of communism, people, individuals, and for their families or for themselves, however they decide, they are creating ideas and wealth to then help them figure out what they're doing with their lives. So it's an adventure too, but it's something that permits human freedom, which is natural to people, and also has concretely, empirically created much more prosperity and wealth, and I would argue human flourishing than any other system.
For students listening, trying to put themselves in the shoes of somebody their age who lives in a communist country, A lot of these communist countries are different with varying levels of restrictions and freedoms. But what is a day in the life of a general modern day person living under communism?
That's another excellent question. Um, I think let's take the example of a young person in Cuba right now. If that person is not the child of a member of the Communist Party, if they're just a regular person, because it's always a minority of people in a communist country that belongs to the Communist Party, and many of them do it because they have to. But then there are some hardcore people that believe in everything. Anyway, let's say you're not the child of a member of the Communist Party. Then right now in Cuba, you're experiencing a lack of food, you're experiencing a lack of electricity, including for days at a time. They're not just having rolling blackouts that people might have in, on the West Coast in California, let's say. Um, and it's not because of those kinds of reasons, right? It's because the state has decided that the food's going to go elsewhere and that they're going to use something like electricity as a weapon. There are also, let's say you're a teenager who likes music or art and has wanted to be involved in expressing yourself that way. If you're pushing that too far, then you, or maybe you have an older sibling or another relative who's actually come out and been very public about it, then you risk being in prison right now. And the prisons in Cuba, there are many, there are hundreds of them, and they are not like a prison in the United States. And I know we can have discussions all day long about whether there should be reform of prisons here, and many want some kind of reform, right? But we're not talking about prison the way we understand it here. And then also remember that this is all based in, rooted in that typical young person in Cuba doesn't have the kinds of rights that somebody here would just take for granted. So thinking of, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and getting together, freedom of the press, even if you're working for your paper at school, and freedom of religion. And those are just the basics. It's all of the freedoms that you don't have. And so that would be going on too. And maybe you'd have a grandmother or mother who would dress up in white and be somebody who would walk after church every Sunday because one of your older siblings or even a parent is in prison, and that's how these women in white protest. And some of them have been arrested, some of them have been otherwise repressed, but they are strong witnesses that I would hope that the young person in Cuba would look to.
And a lot of students might also be hearing that communist countries today don't really follow what Marx and Engels wrote. They are adapting, they're changing their ways to help the modern person enjoy life and have their basic necessities, which we know is a lie. And, based off of what we've just talked about with Cuba. So are modern communist countries still following Marx and Engels in their writings and what they say about communism?
That's an excellent question too. I would say yes and no. The ideology has always been adaptable. And so Lenin himself, part of the reason why we call it Marxism Leninism is because he added some things, he adapted some things, and then every communist country since then has done the same. That said, they always go back to the core of Marxism, the basics that we covered in this talk. And so that is still there, even in the countries that are adapting. And when they adapt, and they especially, some of them adapt, not all of them, I mean, North Korea, not, they adopt on Cuba, not. But let's say, look at something like Vietnam, for example, which a lot of people talk about. When they adapt, it's still, it tends to be economics, and then it's partial, and the state is still controlling, like the state is permitting a limited market, right, in a particular area of the economy. And so that can be taken at any time. And this happens all the time in the People's Republic of China. If somebody who owns a business, who starts a business on his own, does something that the party doesn't like, they take everything from that person, and that person can end up in prison too, in a camp. But anyway, you have to be loyal to the party. You're not loyal to yourself and your own beliefs. You have to be loyal to the party. So it's still not a free market the way it would be under capitalism. And then, even though some of those things may help in terms of people's level of living, standard of living, it's still not as good as it would be if you just took it all away and let it be, a free market. So the communists will say, well, we're helping to raise people out of poverty. They always end up killing and repressing more people than they help lift out of poverty, so called. And then finally, I would like to again repeat the political rights, the rights of that we just take for granted in a country like the United States, are not what any of this is based on.
What's the future of communism, and what is VOC doing about the future of communism? Because like we talked about in the lecture, there are still 1.5 billion people living under communist regimes today. So, in your opinion, where do you see this ideology going?
Right. I hope that at some point it truly ends up on the ash heap of history, as President Ronald Reagan called for back in the 1980s. And it has in certain areas. I mean, we look at Eastern and Central Europe, and today many of them are thriving liberal democracies who use capitalism. But we still have, as we talked about, more than 1.5 billion people forced to live under communist regimes, and that's going to take a while, but it should be on its way out. If we can educate more and more people, both behind the bamboo curtain and other places, down in Cuba and other places where communism is. If people here continue to be educated about what communism is so they can help other people understand you don't want to pick it, then over time, you can have less and less support for it. So that would be one thing. Also, I would say that the United States, over the course of its modern history, has been good about getting facts behind communist lines, so to speak, to help people on the inside resist. And to go back to the Cuba example, there's a lot of resistance going on, even though people are suffering for it. In the People's Republic of China, what we call China, there is resistance going on, even though there are also people suffering all the time for it. And North Korea, it's harder, but anytime anybody gets out, we hear about more, and we know that over time you can't be closed forever. I mean, I would say you just can't be closed forever. So the point is, it's not tomorrow, and we always say at VOC, unfortunately, unless things change right now, there will still be victims of communism tomorrow. So there will be, but we can all do our part to encourage that number to be less and less each day, and then over time to encourage the resistance on the inside, as well as do the responsible public policy from the outside to encourage the change.
And VOC has a curriculum for all those listening that will give you, communism from the basics through the specifics. So we start with definitions like we talked about today, and we go into different countries and different aspects of communism, different countries that communism has touched. And for all students and teachers and parents out there, that is available online at our website. You can download the chapters, and there are resources attached. Any final closing thoughts, Dr. Spalding, on what we talked about today, and what students should take away from this lecture?
Well, two things. One, very practical. We have this wonderful curriculum, which Lily's already talked about. We also have witness project videos and other witness project project products, I guess, for people to go find out more. And a lot of those are you are their stories. So they're very important, and they're great for anybody, especially students. The other thing I would say is read accounts about people who got away from communism or describing communism, and it'll help you understand better. So, two for this level, one takes place in China. It's called Red Scarf Girl. And some of you may have already read it, but if you haven't read it, it is a compelling read, and it takes place during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and it's based on a real story. And then another one that's also a novel but based on a real story is One Day in the Life of Ivan Dezinovich. This is more for probably high school rather than middle school, but it tells one day in the life of a prisoner in the Gulag. And so you get the sweeping bigger story through a personal account in Red Scarf Girl, and then you get one day in the horrible Gulag in the other story. And both of those together will give you a great understanding and flesh out some of what we were talking about today in Communism 101.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Spalding, for the lecture today. And you can find any of these resources that we've discussed at our website, victimsofcommunism.org. And feel free to reach out to our info account or our staff if you have any questions about what we do. And feel free to visit our museum if you are in the DC area. We also do school tours for both homeschool groups, public school, private school, middle school, as well as high school. And we also take college tour groups as well. So thank you, Dr. Spalding, and thanks to Streamable Learning for today's lecture. And we will see you in the next lecture.
Thank you.